Kildare was largely a rural county until recent times. Even though the population figures would have climbed substantially at the beginning of the 19th century, it's only in recent times it became quite urban. And you can see an explosion there in the figures, the population figures in the last 20 years. 3 or 4 of the towns are among the top 30 in the country by size, mixture of commuter belt and big local employers like Intel, Kerry Group, Pfizer. And the figure there for Monasterevin is of some significance because that would have actually placed it among the largest town in the county in recent times. At time it's historically the biggest town in the county, in fact for a long time the only town in the county. Right up till a big population loss at the end of the 19th century. How many communities do we have in the county? How do you define that? Obviously more urbanised than at any stage in previous history, but one measure would be the primary schools. We have 112 of those. We have about 39. We have 39 entries in the Tidy Towns competition. But a lot of places fall halfway between that urban and that rural divide. And sport actually helped define what is a community, because quite clearly somewhere like Kilcullen is a town, but what is Artgarvan, Brannockstown, Calverstown? What were they before they became urbanised in any sense? The little hamlet of Ardclough had about 14 houses. No, the 2 council schemes hadn't been built when they won the 1949 Senior Football Championship. And Rathcoffey falls into that category. It was all action the 17th century. Rathcoffey features everywhere, but then it sort of fell into obscurity. And one of the things that we have seen happen over in the lifetime of the GAA is the GAA helping to define what is a community and what is only a part of a larger community. How do you define a community? It works really by spheres of influence rather than clearly defined boundaries. This is a classic map by Francis John Byrne of the dioceses of Ireland in the 1100s. There are no boundaries, they're just a sphere of influence, and there was overlapping. It worked by family and kindred, Dacia, Folia, Breffni. Boundaries came a little later, replacing the old structures with clearly defined markers, as did the parish boundaries, which have survived to this day. Really, really odd to us looking in today. Place names and boundaries that bear no resemblance to the modern community. That sort of indicates what medieval life was like in Ireland. It probably focused on family, on clan, on friendship. And it's when we come down to the business of seizures, because confiscation of land was a very serious business here, that we begin to see place names, some of which have disappeared. There may have been communities that just disappeared completely because we can't really identify where some of them were that turn up in that 17th century. This is Rathcoffey and William Petty's map of 1659, surrounded by place names, some of which have survived a little bit better than others. Noble's map, 1753. We're beginning to see something that's more recognisable in the modern context, like coffee there. A few more have emerged. And then we get something quite scientific. Alexander Taylor comes along in 1783, manages to survey the parts of the county which were dry, not so good in the boglands. Around here we have a fairly clear demarcation of fields and trees and estates and things like that. We now have a window into a community structure which is different from those medieval parishes, and which was to become quite significant because we had a political movement which organised on a local basis through the whole of North Kildare for the 1798 rebellion. The guys who fought the 1798 rebellion, centres in each of the parishes, in each of the areas. The structures that were put together in 1798 were by necessity secret, but it does look like they endured. The first beneficiary of this would have been Robert Emmet in his 1803 rebellion. He seems to have called in the Old Boys Network, local people in each community, and this is the man who turned it into an art, Daniel O'Connell, because in the 1820s we saw what probably in European terms was the first mass movement. This is Daniel O'Connell's death place in Genoa. I'd really recommend to anyone who's passing through on the cruise ship, getting on your MSC cruise ship, to have a look at it. There's Mr. Finn from Clane handing in his contribution in a very significant year. That's an 1828, very significant date, because on January the 13th, 1828, Daniel O'Connell organised simultaneous meetings in 1,600 parishes. This was not done without a very strong local structure. And my strong suspicion is that when the Fenians started organising, they inherited some of that allegiance, the local structures that had been in place for the previous political organisations. The Fenian trials gave us a little smell of how meetings were being organised. Football matches got together. Now sometimes you can see this is overstated. The state papers are full of conspiracy that every time there was a football match there was a political meeting. But a local sporting allegiance and a political allegiance hand in hand. Does that sound familiar? When Michael Boynton arrived to organise the Land League in Kildare, were those local structures still in place? The first meeting of the GAA was on November the 1st, 1884. It was the second meeting that decided to ally the organisation with Parnell's National League, attaching the organisation to the footprint of O'Connell's popular movement. That was the success story. The GAA ended up at 875 clubs. That compares with 31 largely in Belfast for soccer, which had been operating since 1879, and 55 for rugby, which had been operating since 1873. And they spread into all the smallest parishes, organising athletics rather than the technically more difficult football or even more technically more difficult hurling. Athletic sports was all the rage in the early 1880s. P.P. Sutton was a very prestigious Wexford man. He was the handicapper, he was the editor of Sport magazine, one of the great sources for the early GAA, and he came out to Rathcoffey. Henry Travers in the chair, Paddy Bean as secretary. Committee members Dennis Dunn, Dennis Murray, Edward Flood, John Colgan, Joseph Langan, Francis Doyle, James Riley, Matt Gill, Michael Kelly, James Archer, Thomas Salmon, Thomas Delaney, John Fitzsimon, Francis Coonan, Tom Langan, Mark Travers, William Fennell, Coonan, John Neal, John Fitzsimon, Robert Shore. But you can see a political overlay. Nothing was to contravene the principles and teachings of the National League. Here is a gentleman from the Royal Irish Regiment competing in the sports, which was unusual at the time, even though it was within the rules from 1893 to 1903. And then the 1798 rebellion, it's commemorated in 1898. That actually gave the impetus to the revival of the GAA in Kildare. Some of Rathcoffey's early impact was on the hurling field, where many of the great Clane players that had won All-Ireland medals joined with Rathcoffey, largely through the influence of William Merriman. Here they are playing in 1913 in a match that was not finished because Rosebery had supplied the ball, and when it burst, not another ball was forthcoming to finish out the game. Sport just first came to Kildare in a very different form. The County Kildare Football Club was supposed to promote tennis and polo as well as what was called football at the time, which was effectively the ancestor of the rugby game that we know today. It was welcomed by William Gray, who was the Kildare Observer, and it was really fired up the imagination of the county. The sporting events run by this club and its sister clubs were run by and for the landowners, the professional classes, the aristocracy. And this was not a time for the aristocrats and the Coswinter to work together because the land war was hotting up. And this is John Mahoney. He was captain of the Ballyduff hurling team. You won't see anything named after him nowhere in GAA history, but he's the guy who persuaded Kilmoyley to disband so the Kilmoyley players could join with Ballyduff. They won the All-Ireland Hurling Championship, and the following year the GAA decided that club allegiances no longer mattered when it came to picking county teams. Hey presto, inter-county competition. The whole success of the GAA was based on that. GAA came to dominate popular culture, sporting culture in Ireland, and it all happened in a very short period of time in the 1920s and was founded on a rivalry between these two teams, Kildare and Kerry. A crowd of 20,000 attended the Ireland-Scotland rugby match in 1898. Kildare and Kerry had brought attendances to 18,000 in 1905. Ireland's 1925 soccer international against Scotland in Belfast drew a crowd of 41,000. The Scotland rugby match in Dublin in 1929 drew a crowd of 40,000. In 1929, the All-Ireland final attracted 43,839 spectators, and Gaelic football remained the most popular sport thereafter in terms of attendances. Was it because of the skill levels? Evidently not. It brought large crowds to identify with the teams, the goalkeeper with the bowler hat of Johnny MacDonald, one of two legendary brothers that played with Dublin. The 1926 drawn match was probably the turning point. It's the one that caught the imagination. The great Larry Stanley was among the Kildare players who come out here. You see him very, very tall. By the standards of the time. There's the two mascots coming on, getting a push from Joe MacDonald of Naas. And watch what happens out here to the right, because Joe Loughlin is decided he's just about to play in the All-Ireland final, and he discovered that the best thing to calm the nerves would be to have a cigarette. In keeping with soccer's reputation as a garrison game, the earliest references to it being played in the county are at the Curragh camp. The locals watched on. Ballymore Eustace fell out with the GAA and they joined a breakaway organisation run by Kickham's. Watch here, no rules against those who play other sports such as soccer. Jack Byrne later became a very famous soccer player from Ballymore. Here's an argument against the ban. No objection to the sport, just those who played it. And here in 1926 we see 13 Kildare players had played soccer, 9 had played cricket, and 3 played rugby. That compares with 4 in Dublin. In 1926, the Barrow Drainage Scheme brought soccer to a tie, and they led the movement to form a Midland Counties League. The league featured teams from Tullamore all the way down to Wexford. Not very many of them, but it always kept a presence for the sport in the county. And Newbridge Town, who were one of the original adherents, were refounded and became the county's first League of Ireland soccer team. This is Ballyulster, fell out with the GAA in the 1950s and formed a soccer club in 1959. Vincent McKenna playing against George Best, a youth international from Celbridge. He was one of the most prominent soccer personalities to come from Kildare. In fact, Celbridge were one of the clubs that benefited most when the ban was abolished in 1971. Going through the clubs in alphabetical order, we start with one of the more successful and oldest, Moorfield, our clock of the hurling success. Athgarvan, a suburb of Newbridge. Athy, strong in the 70s. Eadstown, the club of Larry Tompkins. Ellistown, the club of John Joe Donnelly. Ballymore, 1956 champions and a great handball town. Johnstown Bridge, the club of the O'Donohues, very successful in the 80s. Ballykelly, famous rivalry with Monasterevin. And Carbery dominated football in the 1970s. Kappa was founded by Ty Downey just outside Kilcock. Probably would not have existed without the force of his personality. Kilcock very strong in the 1950s. Celbridge emerged in the 2000s. Clane has won more titles than any of the other clubs in senior football. Confey emerged from the shadow of Leixlip. Castledermot very strong in the 1930s. Éire Óg dominated hurling in the 60s. Alan Woods strong in the 70s and was a senior football championship. Leixlip, one of the largest towns in the country, very strong in the 1980s. Monasterevin, a very famous victory in 1977 in the Senior Football Championship. Sarsfields, if you combine their total with Rosebery, have won more titles than Clane, or indeed anyone else. St Lawrence's covers an unusually large area of South Kildare. Raheens was the only Kildare club to win the Leinster Senior Football Championship. There are 55 GAA clubs. In some cases, they are combined teams representing a district at underage, or hurling teams which take in the scope of surrounding areas. Interestingly enough, Kildare does not apply the parish rule, so the smaller clubs are forced to attract players purely on loyalty and not on the prospects of success. You would search the world to find an organisation that is as closely bound up in the community as the GAA is. And how this came about. Did the GAA define our communities? I'm not so sure, but it's quite certain that they would be quite different if the GAA had never existed. A community like our clock was largely created by the GAA. An astonishing win in the Kildare Senior Football Championship in 1949 and a strong tradition of hurling success. And then it acquired quasi-urban status of its own. Some of the places that the GAA represents do not exist on the map, but the people there have no difficulty receiving their sense of identity from a sporting culture that the GAA created, rather than the ecclesiastical or the social or the political culture which would prevail in most societies. The GAA did not create the spirit of community, or indeed the communities of Kildare, but without the GAA it would be a very different place.